No announcements, no explanations, no defending your choices, just silence, and suddenly everything changes. Because the moment a woman stops broadcasting her next move, life starts rearranging itself around her. Here's the part no one tells you. The most powerful shift doesn't happen when you do more. It happens when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening, when you stop shrinking your vision so others feel comfortable, when you stop turning your growth into a group discussion. That silence, it's not emptiness. It's alignment loading. Silence is often misunderstood because it looks passive on the surface. But in reality, it is one of the most deliberate choices a person can make. When a woman chooses silence, she is not withdrawing from power, she is reclaiming it. Weakness seeks validation. Strength does not require witnesses. Silence removes the need to convince, justify, or perform, and that removal is where power consolidates. Every explanation costs energy. Every defense invites debate. Every reaction hands control to something outside of oneself. Silence closes those doors. Strategic silence is not about avoidance, fear, or submission. It is about discernment. It is the decision to invest energy only where it compounds rather than where it dissipates. When a woman stops responding to every provocation, she stops training the world to pull her attention on demand. She becomes harder to manipulate because manipulation depends on predictable reactions. Silence breaks that pattern. It creates uncertainty for others, but certainty within herself. There is also a neurological shift that happens in silence. The brain exits threat response mode. Instead of reacting emotionally, it begins to process intentionally. This allows values to lead rather than impulses. Silence becomes a buffer between stimulus and response, and in that space, choice is born. Choice is power. Socially, silence recalibrates dynamics. People listen more closely when words are scarce. Boundaries become implicit rather than negotiated. Respect often follows not from what is said, but from what is no longer tolerated. Silence communicates self-trust. It signals that approval is no longer the currency driving behavior. Most importantly, silence redirects focus inward. When energy is no longer spent narrating life, it is spent building it. Growth accelerates when it is not constantly exposed to opinion, comparison, or interference. The absence of noise allows identity to solidify, intentions to sharpen, and direction to stabilize. When a woman turns her focus inward, priorities begin to reorganize at a fundamental level. Attention is the most valuable resource she has, and wherever it goes, energy follows. When focus is scattered across pleasing others, managing perceptions, or responding to external demands, priorities become reactive rather than intentional. Self-focus interrupts that pattern. It forces a reevaluation of what truly matters versus what has simply been conditioned to feel urgent. This shift is not selfishness, it is recalibration. When focus is internal, decisions are filtered through alignment instead of obligation. Time, effort, and emotional labor stop being distributed evenly and start being invested wisely. What drains energy becomes visible. What nourishes growth becomes non-negotiable. This rewiring happens quietly, not through dramatic declarations, but through repeated, conscious choices that reinforce self-respect. As priorities realign, identity strengthens. Many women are taught to anchor their sense of worth in usefulness, availability, or harmony. Self-focus dissolves that framework. Worth becomes intrinsic rather than transactional. The need to prove value fades, and with it, the compulsion to overextend. This internal shift changes behavior automatically. Boundaries emerge without force. No becomes easier because yes is no longer free. Cognitively, self-focus increases coherence between thought and action. When attention is no longer divided, decisions become faster and cleaner. There is less second-guessing because choices are rooted in a clear understanding of personal values. This reduces mental fatigue and emotional burnout. Consistency replaces chaos, and momentum builds naturally. Externally, life begins to reflect this internal order. Relationships adjust, responsibilities redistribute, and expectations reset. Some connections weaken because they were sustained by overgiving, while others deepen because they are mutual. This is not loss, it is refinement. As focus sharpens, priorities stabilize, and the internal compass becomes reliable. Clarity is not a starting point. It is the result of intentional attention. Before alignment can occur, a woman must understand what she stands for, what she is building toward, and why it matters to her. Without that internal clarity, decisions are made reactively, guided by pressure, comparison, or short-term relief, rather than long-term direction. Life feels busy but not meaningful because motion replaces purpose. When clarity forms, it simplifies everything. The why becomes a filter that screens out distractions. Opportunities that once felt tempting lose their pull if they do not serve that deeper intention. Commitments that once felt obligatory begin to feel optional. This is not because responsibility disappears, but because purpose organizes responsibility. Alignment is simply the visible result of this internal order. Clarity also reduces emotional turbulence. Much of anxiety comes from misalignment, saying yes when the inner answer is no, staying where growth has ended, or pursuing goals that were inherited rather than chosen. When the underlying reason for action is clear, internal resistance fades. Energy flows more freely because effort is no longer split between action and doubt. Even difficult choices feel lighter when they are anchored in meaning. As clarity strengthens, confidence follows, not as bravado, but as steadiness. A woman no longer needs to borrow certainty from others because her direction is internally validated. Feedback becomes information rather than instruction. Advice is considered without being absorbed. The sense of being pulled in multiple directions dissolves into a singular forward motion. Alignment then shows up naturally in behavior. Habits become consistent because they are purpose-driven rather than discipline-driven. Relationships feel more honest because expectations are grounded in self-awareness. Time is used more intentionally because priorities are clear. Clarity does not make life easy, but it makes it coherent. And coherence is what allows everything else to fall into place. Boundaries are often mistaken for walls, but in reality, they function more like guardrails. They do not limit growth, they protect it. When a woman establishes boundaries, she is not pushing people away. She is defining the conditions under which she can show up fully. Momentum depends on sustained energy, and boundaries are what prevent that energy from being depleted by constant demands, interruptions, and emotional overextension. When boundaries are unclear, progress slows. Time is fragmented, focus is diluted, and emotional labor increases. Much of this happens not because others intend harm, but because access has been left unrestricted. Clear boundaries reduce friction by removing ambiguity. They answer questions before they are asked. They eliminate the need for repeated explanations, negotiations, or justifications. In this way, boundaries conserve energy rather than consume it. There is also a psychological shift that occurs when boundaries are upheld consistently. Self-trust strengthens. Each time a woman honors her own limits, she reinforces the belief that her needs matter. This internal reinforcement creates forward motion because actions are no longer undermined by resentment or exhaustion. Momentum builds when effort is sustainable, not when it is maximal. Importantly, boundaries do not require loud enforcement. The most effective boundaries are often behavioral rather than verbal. They are reflected in availability, response time, and follow-through. Over time, others adjust naturally. Expectations recalibrate. Relationships either align with these limits or fall away, creating space for what truly supports growth. Boundaries also sharpen focus. When fewer distractions are allowed access, attention deepens. Work becomes more intentional. Rest becomes more restorative. Emotional responses become measured rather than reactive. This creates a rhythm that supports long-term progress rather than short bursts followed by burnout. Through boundaries, momentum becomes self-sustaining. Energy is preserved, direction remains clear, and growth accelerates without constant force. The absence of chaos allows movement to feel steady, deliberate, and increasingly effortless. If this resonates, pause for a moment. Take a breath and ask yourself, where am I leaking energy by explaining instead of becoming? Stay with me. Consistency is often undervalued because it lacks spectacle. It does not announce itself, demand attention, or produce immediate applause. Yet it is the force that quietly compounds effort into transformation. Visibility, on the other hand, can create the illusion of progress without the substance of it. When a woman prioritizes consistency over being seen, she invests in outcomes rather than appearances. True growth happens in repetition. Small actions performed daily reshape identity over time. Skills sharpen, confidence stabilizes, and discipline becomes instinctive. None of this requires an audience. In fact, excessive visibility can interrupt the process by introducing comparison, pressure, and premature validation. When progress is constantly shared, the mind can confuse acknowledgement with achievement. The work feels complete before it truly is. Working offstage allows for imperfection. Mistakes can be made without scrutiny. Strategies can be tested without judgment. This freedom accelerates learning because energy is spent refining rather than performing. Consistency thrives in privacy because it is insulated from external opinion. The focus stays on process instead of perception. There is also an emotional advantage to staying unseen while building. Expectations remain low, which reduces anxiety. Without the need to maintain an image, effort can be redirected toward mastery. Confidence grows internally rather than being borrowed from feedback. When results finally emerge, they carry weight because they are supported by depth, not hype. Over time, consistent action reshapes self-trust. A woman begins to rely on her own follow-through rather than motivation or encouragement. This creates stability. Progress no longer depends on mood, recognition, or external reinforcement. It becomes part of her identity. When visibility eventually arrives, it feels different. It is not something chased, but something that follows naturally. Results speak with authority because they are rooted in sustained effort. Consistency builds the foundation quietly, and when the structure stands on its own, attention becomes a byproduct rather than the goal. Reaction feels instinctive, but it is one of the fastest ways to lose power. A reaction happens automatically, pulled outward by circumstances, people, or emotions. It is driven by urgency rather than intention. When a woman reacts, her energy is dictated by something external, and control quietly shifts away from her. Every reactive moment reinforces a pattern where attention is hijacked and direction is compromised. Response is different. A response is chosen. It requires a pause, and that pause is where power lives. In that space, emotion is acknowledged without being obeyed. Perspective has time to form. Instead of being pushed into action, a woman pulls herself into alignment with her values. This single distinction changes everything. Life no longer feels like a series of interruptions, but a sequence of deliberate moves. Emotionally, constant reaction keeps the nervous system in a heightened state. Stress compounds. Small triggers feel large because there is no buffer between stimulus and action. Over time, this creates exhaustion and resentment. Responding restores balance. The body calms, the mind clears. Decisions are made with awareness rather than defense. Energy is preserved because it is not spent putting out fires that did not need to burn. Socially, reaction invites escalation. It feeds conflict, drama, and misunderstanding. Response de-escalates. It sets the tone rather than absorbs it. When a woman responds instead of reacts, she becomes less predictable, less controllable, and more respected. Others adjust because the usual emotional hooks no longer work. Internally, response builds self-mastery. Each intentional choice reinforces the belief that she governs herself. Confidence grows not from dominance, but from restraint. Strength is expressed through composure. Over time, this practice reshapes identity. She is no longer someone who is easily provoked or pulled off course. Her energy stays centered, her direction remains intact, and her presence becomes steady regardless of external noise. Reaction feels instinctive, but it is one of the fastest ways to lose power. A reaction happens automatically, pulled outward by circumstances, people, or emotions. It is driven by urgency rather than intention. When a woman reacts, her energy is dictated by something external, and control quietly shifts away from her. Every reactive moment reinforces a pattern where attention is hijacked and direction is compromised. Response is different. A response is chosen. It requires a pause, and that pause is where power lives. In that space, emotion is acknowledged without being obeyed. Perspective has time to form. Instead of being pushed into action, a woman pulls herself into alignment with her values. This single distinction changes everything. Life no longer feels like a series of interruptions, but a sequence of deliberate moves. Emotionally, constant reaction keeps the nervous system in a heightened state. Stress compounds. Small triggers feel large because there is no buffer between stimulus and action. Over time, this creates exhaustion and resentment. Responding restores balance. The body calms. The mind clears. Decisions are made with awareness rather than defense. Energy is preserved because it is not spent putting out fires that did not need to burn. Socially, reaction invites escalation. It feeds conflict, drama, and misunderstanding. Response de-escalates. It sets the tone rather than absorbs it. When a woman responds instead of reacts, she becomes less predictable, less controllable, and more respected. Others adjust because the usual emotional hooks no longer work. Internally, response builds self-mastery. Each intentional choice reinforces the belief that she governs herself. Confidence grows not from dominance, but from restraint. Strength is expressed through composure. Over time, this practice reshapes identity. She is no longer someone who is easily provoked or pulled off course. Her energy stays centered, her direction remains intact, and her presence becomes steady regardless of external noise. Inner stability acts like an unseen organizing force. When a woman is internally grounded, the external world begins to mirror that steadiness without conscious effort. This is not mysticism, it is behavioral alignment. Inner stability means emotions are regulated, values are clear, and reactions are measured. When these elements are consistent, they influence every interaction, decision, and boundary she sets, often without words. People respond to what feels stable. Chaos seeks chaos, but it also avoids what it cannot penetrate. When a woman no longer oscillates between uncertainty and overcompensation, others instinctively adjust their behavior around her. Conversations become more respectful, expectations become clearer, manipulation loses traction because it relies on emotional volatility. Stability removes the leverage. Opportunities also reorganize. When inner stability is present, choices are made from discernment rather than desperation. This filters what enters her life. She no longer chases situations that require her to abandon herself. As a result, the opportunities that remain are better aligned with her capacity and direction. This creates a sense of flow, not because effort disappears, but because resistance does. There is a compounding effect at play. Stable inner patterns create consistent external signals. Consistency builds trust, both self-trust and social trust. Over time, systems respond to reliability. Work environments grant more autonomy. Relationships become more reciprocal. Life becomes easier to manage because fewer variables are emotionally charged. Inner stability also reduces noise. When internal conflict quiets, external chaos becomes less disruptive. A woman can move through disorder without absorbing it. This containment changes how problems resolve themselves. Many issues dissolve simply because they are no longer fed with emotional energy. What appears as things falling into place is actually alignment revealing itself. The outer world is responding to the clarity, calm, and coherence established within. Stability becomes the center of gravity, and everything else adjusts accordingly. Transformation is often imagined as something dramatic, loud, and immediately visible, but real change rarely announces itself. It unfolds in private, through small, repeated shifts that are almost unnoticeable in the moment. When a woman is truly transforming, she is usually not talking about it. She is adjusting habits, rethinking beliefs, and restructuring her inner world away from commentary and applause. The silence is not secrecy, it is focus. Quiet transformation protects the process. Growth is fragile in its early stages. When it is exposed too soon, it becomes vulnerable to doubt, comparison, and external influence. Opinions can interrupt momentum before it has a chance to solidify. Working in silence allows change to stabilize internally before it is tested externally. By the time results appear, they are no longer dependent on validation. There is also a psychological advantage to keeping transformation quiet. The brain associates declared goals with a sense of completion. Talking about change can provide emotional reward without the effort, reducing follow-through. Silence removes that shortcut. Progress must be earned through action rather than words. This strengthens discipline and deepens commitment. As transformation continues unseen, identity begins to shift. Actions accumulate evidence. Confidence grows not because of encouragement, but because of lived proof. This kind of confidence is durable. It does not fluctuate with feedback or recognition. It is rooted in knowing rather than hoping. Eventually, results surface, not as announcements, but as differences others can feel. Choices are firmer, presence is calmer, direction is clearer. The contrast becomes undeniable, precisely because there was no performance leading up to it. The noise arrives later, created by outcomes rather than intention. What changed quietly now stands visibly, carrying weight because it was built without needing to be witnessed. When a woman chooses focus over noise and intention over reaction, life begins to reorganize itself in ways that feel almost effortless. Silence stops being absence and becomes direction. Self-focus stops being selfish and becomes clarity. Boundaries stop being conflict and become structure. Each quiet decision compounds, shaping identity long before it shapes circumstances. Nothing here is about disappearing or shrinking. It is about consolidating power. By focusing inward, responding instead of reacting, and building consistently without an audience, a woman creates inner stability that the outside world cannot ignore. People adjust, opportunities align, chaos loses its grip. What once required force now responds to presence. What looks like everything falling into place is not luck or coincidence. It is alignment revealing itself after a period of unseen work. Transformation does not need to be loud to be real. It only needs to be sustained. When the noise fades and focus sharpens, results emerge naturally, speaking with authority because they were built in silence and anchored in purpose.